Junior Johnson was raised in that house and honed his skills as a driver, first hauling moonshine liquor on the roads around here. Then he went on to become one of the most successful and intriguing personalities in the history of the sport. Join me today as we hear Junior Johnson tell his own story on The Great Drivers. The famed writer Tom Wolfe called him the last great American hero in one of the most quoted and celebrated short stories in recent history. Junior Johnson fit the definition. From the time he blistered the roads of North Carolina on his wild bootlegging runs to his domination of Grand National stock car racing in the early 1960s. He won 50 major races before retiring in his mid-30s to become the most successful team owner in the sport. Today, he's developed a giant racing complex near his birthplace in Rhonda, North Carolina, and the bucket seat of his stock car, occupied by such superstars as Bobby Allison, Cale Yarborough, and Darrell Waltrip, is the most coveted in the sport. Junior, an awful lot of people today recognize you as one of the most successful car owners in NASCAR, but it may be that some of the younger people don't remember you as a driver. You dominated Grand National stock car racing in the early 1960s, and all of a sudden, just bang, you quit. Really in the prime of your life as a driver. You were in your middle 30s, as I recall. Was there any specific reason why you stopped driving?
Well, not really. I had a pretty successful background as far as being able to build my own cars and stuff and driving too. And I had a lot of knowledge of what it took to run a racing team. And of course I was running my own operation and driving it too. I was tied in with Ford Motor Company, which gave me the financial aid that I needed to run an operation and not drive it. So I considered how many races I had been in and how good I'd done at it as a driver, and I started evaluating the future of where I was going and what I was going to do. And it was awful hard for me to quit at the time because I was in the prime of my racing career. I was 34 years old, and I felt like anybody could beat me if my car didn't let me down. So I was in, good shape in the driving department. But when I evaluated where I was going and what I was going to be doing down the road and stuff, I felt like I made the right decision when I quit. I immediately went into owning cars and forming my own operation and stuff, and it's proved out to back up what I thought would happen, that I could be successful at. I could make a lot more money in owning the cars I could drive, and I had a lot longer future in it, and from that aspect.
Did you ever have any second thoughts?
I did a time or two when my drivers that I was choosing weren't working out like I thought they ought to, because it was pretty hard to stand and watch a guy drive a race car when you felt like you could beat him. And at the time when I first started picking up drivers, along in 66 and 67, I still had them credentials where I could beat him. There weren't no question about it. But then I came on with a real successful operation in 68 and 69 with Leroy Yarber. I accepted the fact then that there were drivers out there that I could get that could do the job for me, and probably as good, if not better drivers at that time of my life than I would have been. And then's when I, felt comfortable of being a car owner.
And we'll be back with more from Junior Johnson and the Great Drivers after this. Junior, when you grew up just down the road a mile or so from here, had you ever in your wildest dreams thought about a racing complex that was going to be as big and beautiful as this one is right now?
Not really. When I first started trying to put together what you see here today, it was a sort of a game plan and a future plan for somebody that never ever thought that they would be in racing the rest of their life, which I feel like now probably will be. But when I bought the property, I tried to start figuring out what was the best thing for me and my wife Flossie to do to make sure we had a future, something that we could do ourselves and make a good living in. So at that time, Holly Farms was a big poultry business, was operating here in Wilkes County, and it was just getting going real good. So I felt like if I built some chicken houses, which me and her could take care of, that would give us a future that we could work at as long as we both chose to. So I first built chicken houses to make money with. Then I started taking that money and building us a home. So I kept on racing, though, and adding what little I could win to what we was already doing. And it weren't long till we had our chicken houses paid for and we had our home built and it paid for. Then I was doing real good as a driver. Then I started kind of getting off into the, you know, the car ownership of the thing, and it's growed and growed and growed. And there's no way in my wildest imagination I could ever believe it. We could have did what we've did here.
It's almost like you've lived two separate lives. The young, wild, woolly days of the legendary Junior Johnson, the movie Junior Johnson, the bootlegger, liquor hauling, wild man of the highways and Thunder Road and all that stuff. And now a different kind of a life, but a much more settled life and much more organized, and I'm sure probably in a lot of ways happier life. But it must have been tough. I mean, you forget, I think, probably when people go through and they write about those things and talk about them, they imagine only the good times. It must have been a hard time in your life, though, really, wasn't it, when you were growing up?
Well, I think anybody grew up like I did through the bootlegging days and stuff. It was one of the hardest, toughest lives you could possibly live, really. It was dangerous from a standpoint of hauling moonshine on the highways. You had to run at high rates of speed all the time. It was not only dangerous for you, it was dangerous for other people that was on the highway. But it was a way of life, and you accepted that as your way of making money, making a living, and getting ahead in life. You didn't think at the time that it was against any kind of law as far as nature's concerned. You didn't think you was doing harm to some other person or stuff, and you accepted it as that. And most people didn't believe that there was really anything wrong with fooling with moonshine. But once I got off into racing and I realized I could make a living without that, I tried very, very hard to get away from the moonshine life and get into something that I felt like was better for me and better for my wife Flossie, where we could enjoy life, basically not have to fear that one night I was going to be killed on the highway with a load of moonshine or picked up and put in jail over it or that type of thing. So although in my younger days it was a thrill to me, I really enjoyed the thrill of outrunning the revenues and being contest by them every time I went out on the highway and this type of thing. It was just a way of life. You competed basically like you do on the racetrack today. You'd take off down the highway with a load of moonshine, and you almost just defied the law to try to catch you might say. But I'm sure it was the youngness and the wildness that I enjoyed in it then. Later in life, I think it was probably wrong and all, but you can't back up in this day and time.
Junior, was there any given day or any given time that you can remember when you knew that you were really good behind the wheel, that you were better than a lot of the other guys that you were either on the highways with or racing against? Was there a moment that you said, hey, I'm really good at this, I can do well at this sport?
Well, the first few times I ever run a stock car, I knew that the guys that was running stock cars did not have what I thought I had. Because on the highway, I had a lot of good friends that was good, you know, drivers, and they was as good as you could possibly run into, I think. They never did, some of them didn't get into the racing, but I think I've met many drivers in the bootlegging business was better drivers than I've ever seen on the racetrack. Curtis Turner was the only guy that I thought was a contest to me as a driver. I know there was a lot of people who had faster cars and stuff than I did, but if I had a slower car, I always was able to make up the lost time by being able to outdrive them. Curtis came from the same kind of school basically I did. He lived, you know, back in the mountains up around Martinsville and Roanoke, Virginia, and up in there. And he hauled moonshine himself as a growing up, so he sort of picked up the same techniques that I did. But I don't think there's anybody when I had the car and equipment that I thought could outdrive.
But Curtis was one man that, of course, he was a legend and a giant of a man. He was a man, though, that you felt you'd really have to run hard to beat.
Well, I enjoyed running against Curtis, and one time back in '60, '61, I had two Pontiacs that Holly Farms was supporting for me, and Curtis was a big drawing card, so several racetracks would make deals to get him to come in and drive cars and stuff. And they made a deal a few times for him to drive one of the cars that, of course, I was driving. And I basically enjoyed running with Curtis. I would give him whichever car he wanted, because I wanted to satisfy my own mind that I could handle him in any given situation. So I chose on every occasion that he drove to let him drive both cars, pick him a car, because I wanted him to feel like he weren't being shortchanged, and I wanted to beat him with what he thought was the best. And I didn't have a lot of trouble beating Curtis one-on-one with the same kind of equipment. Like I say, I did have problems with guys that had faster cars than I had, and I had to try to make up a difference by outdriving them. That was the only time I ever felt like it. I had to overextend myself as far as driving a car was concerned.
Junior, you employ how many men at the full racing strength when you go racing at the beginning of the season or in the season? How many men do you actually have on staff?
Well, last year we had 28 guys, and of course that's not counting secretaries and bookkeepers and stuff like that. But the coming year we'll be around 40 people. When we take on Neil's operation, it don't take as many people to do both cars as it does to do one, because you got to maintain a staff of machinists and that type of stuff, and fabricators, which them people can utilize both teams, and it allows you not to have to hire over 10 or 12 people to do another whole racing team.
Your operation is in many ways more complete than some of the other teams in that you do an awful lot. You do your own engine building, and you do an awful lot of fabrication of parts that some other racing teams don't do. Is that right?
We do. We try to make as many pieces of that operation as we can possibly make. And the more of them we make, the more successful we get also. So we're looking at basically down the road making as many parts as we can possibly make. And in the past I have sold a lot of parts, and I've sold a lot of knowledge. I'm looking at very strongly curtailing that kind of deal, because I find myself day in and day out trying to outrun various things that I have made or created, and that's not been good for me, other than I was in a financial stage to where I had to sell to be able to utilize making of certain parts, because they're very expensive when you're making experimental stuff. It costs you like 3 times what it normally would cost you if somebody else is making. You just went out and bought it. So I think now with the two-car operation we have, with the sponsors we have, the way racing has kept increasing financially wise, we'll be able to utilize our facilities and make the various parts and pieces that we need that should give us an advantage down the road.
Junior, when you're around, when you're home, and you're not on the road racing, how many hours a day will you put in with a race team, and how much? I know you love to hunt and you love to be around the house. How do you split your life up when you're in a normal week here?
Well, in the past, I did do a lot more hunting than I have been doing lately. The kind of hunting I do is at nighttime. I have a bunch of coon dogs, and me and a friend of mine used to hunt like 3 or 4 nights a week when I was home. I haven't been able to do that right lately because the requirement time of racing anymore to make sure that everything's you know, exact like it ought to be every time you go to the racetrack has required a lot more of my time, so that takes away from what I like to do a whole lot. But I don't, you know, I don't feel bad about it because we have been successful. It has paid off, and I accept the fact that you have to give up something to gain something. So it's been a pretty good deal all around for me.
Is it as fun as it used to be? I mean, when you were a tighter, smaller operation and things were a little less hectic and not as much money at stake?
Well, the fun part about racing is running like 15 or 18 races. You can run a race or two and say, well, guys, let's just take off for a week or two and go do some of the things you like to do. The way we are now, it is a 12, 14-hour day job, 365 days a year, and you're gone from home an average of 5 days a week. That's not as much fun as being able to just load up and go to the beach or go to the mountains and do what you'd like to do. So you got to accept the fact that you're either going to go for the championship or just go to win a certain amount of races.
The business is just boomed, hasn't it? A lot more. Is it bigger than, say, you had expected to have been, say, 5 years ago?
Probably 100 times bigger than even I could imagine it had been 5 years. Back, I didn't think racing would grow to what it is today. The last 3 years, the growth of racing has been unbelievable to me because you always feel like at some time or another everything's going to peak out. But I think racing really, from what I've seen the last 3 years, is just now getting started. I think it's going to reach a plateau of baseball, football, and that type of stuff, and if it does, there's no end to how it's going to grow to get there.
Well, I'm seeing you're building all over the hills, all over here. You're going to have a little industrial park here in the next couple of years.
Well, we think that's what it's going to do. You know, it's going to grow to the extent you got to have your own little factories and stuff of that nature, and that's what we're planning for. I think in the next 3, 4 years, if we continue to do what we're thinking racing's going to do, we're going to spend, you know, millions of dollars building facilities to take care of what we think racing's headed towards.
Boy, that's an exciting prospect, and we'll be back with more from Junior Johnson after this. I'm sure that a lot of people look at you and say, boy, what a dream life. It just couldn't have laid out more perfectly for you, and everything seems to be breaking your way. But in retrospect, is there anything, if you could step back and do it over again, is there anything you would change?
I don't think so. A lot of people says, well, you might like to have not done the part in your life about the bootlegging stuff. I think I've been very, very fortunate. I've had 3 careers in my life, and most people doesn't really accomplish one. I had a career in the moonshine business. I had a career as a race driver, and I've had a good career as a car owner. I don't think any one of them I would go back and redo. Some of them I don't agree with, but I enjoyed all 3 careers, and I accept them for what they are, and I'm very happy with them.
So life is good. and as you say, the growth factor, and it may be the future is even holds more excitement than the past in a lot of ways.
I think it does. I think where we're headed in racing is going to be unbelievable to a lot of people in the next 10 years.
Well, it's hard to imagine how far it's come since those. I mean, you started out, you ran almost exclusively dirt tracks, didn't you, when you started to race, half miles and miles?
We didn't know of anything like a big, racetrack at the time I started out. Darlington was the biggest one, and they'd run like 100 and 150 miles there. Nobody ever dreamed that you'd run 500-600 miles and be able to make a car stand up and run that long. So it's the advancement of the racetracks, the people that supports it, the fans and stuff. It's just grows by the leaps and bounds, it's just no end to it.
Junior, we can't thank you enough for appearing with us today and sharing your thoughts about the sport. You're one of the giants in the business, and it's a corny thing to say, a legend in his own time, but we're sure happy to have you with us, and we're very grateful that you spent this time with us. I'm Brock Yates with Junior Johnson, one of the great drivers.